It is a great honor to welcome Ofir Haivry on this podcast. He is the Vice President of the Herzl Institute and a co-founder of the Edmund Burke Foundation. And in this hour, we are discussing his magnificent book, John Selden and the Western Political Tradition. Ofir, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Okay. I should like to first begin by asking you about the organizations in which you work at, the Herzl Institute and the Burke Foundation. I understand that they are both brain children of one Yoram Hazony, in which I was introduced to Soudan from. And to what extent are the operations of these two institutions overlap?
Well, in both institutions, Yoram Hazony and myself were co-founders. In the Edmund Burke Foundation with some other people too. Basically, Yoram Hazony and I have been partners in intellectual and entrepreneurship, we might say, for it's already, I think, more than 30 years. And so we created an organization called the Shalem Center, which became a college. And then we established about 10 years ago, the Herzl Institute, which is basically focused on doing some things that unfortunately no one else in the world is currently doing, working on I would say, very, I would say, in broad terms, the impact of Jewish ideas on Western civilization. Basically, usually today in academia and in other places, Jewish studies and, let's say, general philosophy are two very unconnected disciplines. And they are studied and taught as if there is a very limited extent of overlap. In fact, both Yoram Hazony and I recognized early on that, in fact, the Jewish ideas and Jewish traditions have had a major impact on Western ideas in general and Western political thought more specifically. And of course, there is a role for Judaism as part of the West. But what we mean specifically is those ideas who were used, I would say, consciously by Western thinkers to foster some aspects, some political or cultural aspects that they believed in. We might go into that later when we talk about Selden, but in general, this phenomenon is described as political Hebraism, basically using Jewish and more specifically Hebrew sources to inform political ideas in the same way that it's accepted that Roman ideas and Greek ideas entered, the term republic and so on entered and is a founding part of the Western political thought. We are uncovering the same for the Jewish tradition. So this is the goal and the role of the Herzl Institute. Later on, as we met people from Europe and the US who were interested in this endeavor, and also in our broader view of Western civilization as something that is, I would say, present a kind of traditionalist worldview, which is today under attack from many directions, and which it is valuable to defend. And so we created the Edmund Burke Foundation with several partners from the US and Europe. And in fact, we are having a conference in July in Washington, D.C., And in the future, we also hope to extend the same activity beyond Europe and the US to other countries and to Asia and to South America and so on and so forth.
Mhm.
That's it in brief.
Yes, wonderful. And yes, I do know that the Burke Foundation is responsible for many of the national conservative conferences. The latest one, I believe, as of this recording, takes place in Brussels, Belgium. And
Yes.
my question to you is that how would you assess or compare the reception of national conservative ideas in Europe and in the US of A?
Well, in general, the national conservative conferences were and are the main brainchild of the Edmund Burke Foundation, because basically we addressed the problem that when we started to be active about 10 years ago, we addressed the problem that there was a clear crisis of conservative ideas, meaning on one level, there seemed to be a success with many conservative parties in power. In other places, the main opposition. So it looked as if conservative ideas are battling, on the intellectual battlefield, and the political battlefield as equals. But in fact, we recognized or we identified the problem that many so-called conservatives, individuals and organizations, are in fact simply moderately liberal, meaning they have nothing actually conservative about them. And when we try to identify what are the broad lines of conservatism, we find that some of these so-called conservatives don't have any single principle to which they could say, I adhere to this principle. Basically, they are prudent liberals, which is fine to be a prudent liberal, but that is not a conservative. A conservative is someone that has a number of beliefs, which after, I think, 4 of our conferences, we actually had created a kind of statement of principles, which is also published on our website, trying to define what we mean. And one of the main points was that, and that is why we created this series of conferences called National Conservatism, because we believe that national identity and national sovereignty are a vital part of a conservative worldview, while the liberal view doesn't see the nation as something real. So one of our first efforts was to create these national conservative conferences for people to understand better that the national part, if you want, of national conservatives. To begin with, we were attacked as really several mainstream conservative outlets and organizations wrote, being a nationalist conservative is un-American, is unconservative. And the same in Europe, we were attacked for being extreme, merely for the use of the word national or nationalist in our views. I believe that at this point, this has been accepted, not only accepted, but I believe that at this point, in most countries, the mainstream conservatives have accepted the importance of national identity as a vital element of a conservative outlook. And there are other aspects that we are working on to, in a sense, reintroduce, because we feel that nothing we do is actually new. We are simply restoring things that were there and were, in a way, tossed to the side in the last, let's say, 20 years or 30 years. Basically, since the Cold War ended, there was this feel among conservatives that the West had won the battle of ideas and all is good. And basically now everything will be tinkering between moderate liberals and moderate conservatives. In fact, we have witnessed, and we are witnessing, the onslaught of the woke ideas that it has basically destroyed large parts of academia, certainly the social sciences and the arts, and the media and the culture is affected by this. Not, again, I'm not talking about attacking conservatives. They are destroying even liberals now. So actually our success, I think, is to a great extent, a result of our correct, I would say, diagnosis of the problem. When even 10 years ago, people were saying, everything is fine, it's a bit of tinkering, a bit left here, a bit right there. In fact, what we see in many countries, it's a kind of awakening to the fact that there are very deep problems that need addressing, and that is why we're continuing with our conferences.
Yes, and I wish you all the best of successes with the conferences as well as the foundation as a whole. Now, from that, I'd like to ask, so why do you see the nation state as a conservative project? Well, considering this, 19th century nationalism, at least in Europe, is fueled by liberalism also when it comes to, I think, the country that I'm currently staying at, Hungary, which you're obviously familiar with. And of course, the idea of Zionism, which founded your home country of Israel, I would say it's decidedly not very conservative. And the founders of the United States, they break away from a certain tradition, which is the common law tradition of England. So why is it that the nation state becomes a conservative project in contemporary times?
So first of all, I believe that what you are your question is a result or is the effect of the large misconception that is going on in the academia. What you are describing is exactly what is being taught in academia today. But our belief is that this is actually not having nothing to do with reality. For about 2 generations, there has been a liberal narrative of history. Once it was hotly contested, then it became accepted because of a coalition between Marxists and liberals. Liberals said, we created the nation state. Marxists, which were against the nation state, said, yes, liberal created the nation state. And there was this kind of agreement. But in fact, this has nothing to do with reality. And I'll give you some examples. So to begin with, one, liberalism is based on the idea of the sovereignty of the individual, which then individuals create civil society and the state by a social contract. So as you can see, there is no place for a nation here. If anything, this argument is that the state is the nation, meaning the state created by the social contract is a kind of nation, you could say. And that is the liberal take on what the nation state means. Basically, individuals are self-governing, self-created. There is no importance for their culture, their nation, their religion. These are all voluntary associations. I might voluntarily be part of this state, move to that state. Basically, I am really a citizen of the world. And every single state should have the same constitution as every other one. That is the basic belief of liberalism. It's common to Grotius, to Locke, Kant, to Rousseau. They all believe that all states should be essentially the same because nations are simply a kind of club. Basically, it's like if you want to have a red flag or a blue flag or a yellow flag, you can have it. It's not important. The same. You can call yourself part of this nation, of that nation, but it's not essential to your identity or your politics. This is the liberal view. And liberals have been trying to square the circle about this, but there is no place for a nation in liberalism. In fact, all important liberal thinkers have said that having religious or national allegiances is a danger for the social contract, because the social contract is a contract between individuals in a specific area. A contract which means that we are all, our allegiance is to the contract. But if I am a member of a nation within that area, and I say, I'm a Hungarian, meaning I want to be part of the Hungarian nation, which is not the same as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, means that I am working against this state because I want the independence of my nation, for example. So clearly what I'm saying is that liberalism is fundamentally opposed to the idea of national identity and nationalism and the nation. One. On the other hand, conservatives overall, conservative thought is about tradition. So conservatism is better defined as a traditionalist way of thinking, a traditionalist way of knowing, of understanding the world. And in this, and I would say all conservatives, or almost all conservatives at least, agree that the best vehicle for transmitting a tradition is in fact the nation, meaning the most important traditions that define us, like our language, like our religious traditions, like our customs, and so on and so forth, our food even, are all to some level connected to the nation. Even religion, which you might say, but wait, in fact, Christianity is a universal religion. But that is something that only an academic can say, because in fact, every Christian belongs to a specific church, even though Christianity is a universal ideal. In fact, if I am Italian, I, in fact, belong to an Italian church that has Italian saints, that has many Italian, I would say, characteristics. That is true even among Catholics. Certainly, the Orthodox churches are even more national. The Anglican Church is certainly national in Britain and so on. So thinking that religion is an abstract thing, that you somehow are connected with Christianity without any kind of tradition, local and national, is simply not knowing what a religion is. There is no church in the world where there is no connection with the local and national tradition. Those churches, maybe some church in a train station, although I'm not sure even about that, but in general, churches, like language, like even the way you dress, all these are connected to your own national tradition. So this is the first, this division between the nation, which is basically a central element of conservatism, and which is opposed to the main ideas of liberalism. Now about the historical examples you gave me. So I will start by the earliest one, which is the American so-called revolution. Why so-called? Because in fact, when the Americans were struggling against Britain, they were arguing that they were defending their rights as Englishmen, their traditional rights from Magna Carta and so on, that were being attacked by King George III of Great Britain. Later on, there was a period, in fact, of liberalism in America. The Declaration of Independence is, in fact, a rather Lockean document. But in fact, I would say the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution that was created according to it, the first American Constitution, which is better known as the Articles of Confederation, was an absolute failure. Meaning, after 11 years, everyone in America believed that the country is bankrupt, ungovernable, and is going to break down either into regional groups or if every state will be independent. Because the liberal understanding of America had completely failed. And so, as you might know, in Philadelphia, a group of people convened for the Constitutional Convention. And their goal was to restore the constitution that was as close to the original one, meaning the British Constitution, as possible. And in fact, I believe, as did Edmund Burke and most of the people who wrote the Constitution, I believe that the American Constitution is simply a version of the British Constitution. I can explain why, but let me explain this point. Edmund Burke believed that there is a connection between a working constitution and the people, meaning that if you take a constitution, even a perfect so-called constitution, to another people, it won't work there. It's impossible to simply take a constitution. It doesn't work that way. A constitution is actually connected to the character, if you want, the national character, to the traditions and the way of thinking of the people. So people don't know that. Most people don't know that. For instance, the American Constitution was adopted as is in both Mexico and Nigeria in the past. And in both cases, within 10 years, there was a dictatorship. Because clearly, the American Constitution isn't a good fit for Mexico or for Nigeria. They need their own constitution. I'm not saying they cannot take any element from the American Constitution. I'm saying that simply taking one constitution and putting it in another place, it doesn't mean that it will work, and in fact, it failed. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about it, that the American Constitution is fit for the national character of Americans. And in fact, the founding fathers believed that Americans were, their national character was a kind of American English, meaning the way of thinking, the way of regarding the law, the liberties that they believe they have were all originating in the British tradition. That is why you may know, or you might not know, that in American law, to this day, if there is a lacuna, let's say there is a problem that the law doesn't cover, how does the judicial system address it? It looks for precedents from common law, meaning common law to this day is still a source for American law. More than that, you might know there was a case in the American Supreme Court about Guantanamo, meaning what is the constitutional status of people held in Guantanamo? Since it's not in the US, they are not US citizens, but on the other hand, it's a US Army base and so on. If someone reads the actual Supreme Court decision on that, the interesting thing is one of the precedents that is used to explain the situation in Guantanamo are rulings from British law, from British India in the 1760s, meaning before the United States even existed. So the Supreme Court of the United States in the 21st century thinks it can use a precedent from British India. And why is it? Why doesn't it use a precedent from France or Germany or Russia? It's because the American law system is based, and it's acknowledged to be based on the British one. Furthermore, many of the sections of the constitutions of the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights are actually taken from the British Constitution and from the British Bill of Rights. Finally, I will bring you the example that clearly the division into branches and the powers of the legislative, judiciary, and executive are taken from the British Constitution, meaning the prerogatives of the authority of the American president is almost identical to that of the English king of that time. And the same for the House of Representatives, and the same for the judiciary. And finally, the Senate is a mix of the executive, judiciary, and legislative. Most people think that in America there is a strict division, but in fact, the Senate is part of the legislature, clearly, but also it has judicial power of impeachment, and also it has the power to veto the appointment of the president of high-ranking officials like Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State. So this capability of the Senate is exactly the capability of the House of Lords, meaning it's a copy-paste thing. And in fact, Edmund Burke explained that the heart of the English Constitution of his time was the House of Lords. Of course, the Americans could not copy it because they don't have an aristocracy. So he said, so they created the Senate as the closest thing to an aristocracy that they have, the least democratic part of the American Constitution, since senators are elected only every 6 years. That's the longest span of time that an elected official is elected to. And also, interestingly, he argued that the federal system is the heart of the American Constitution, the same as the aristocracy was the heart of the British Constitution. So the Americans simply replaced aristocracy with the federal system. But basically, his argument was that the American Constitution is a version of the British one. So my own view, and other people agree with me, other people disagree, of course, but many agree, is that actually the US was a kind of restatement of national traditions by the English in America. The same might be said for Zionism. As a political organization, Zionism was certainly created in 1897 by Theodor Herzl. But Theodor Herzl was not a liberal. Anyone who reads his views sees he was a conservative. And more than that, Zionism was merely a political tool, like in a way, the Continental Congress. The question is, did Americans exist before the Continental Congress, or did the Continental Congress create Americans? Not America, Americans. Now, most Americans would have said, no, we are already a nation. We have our own characteristics, we have our own traditions, we have our own way of thinking, way of talking. So the same is for Zionism. Zionism is a national agency for Jews, but the Jewish people existed before. The Jewish people weren't created in 1897. Simply a political organization was created in 1897. So, and the same I could say with Italy or Hungary. So Italy became independent in 1859. Does it mean that before that there were no Italians? Clearly there were Italians, only there was no Italian state. In the same way as Poland existed and then it got partitioned for 150 years. During these years, was there a Polish nation or not? According to the liberal view, there was no Polish nation. There were other states in which some people lived, but the Poles themselves believed that there was a Polish nation. So basically, my argument is that a nation and a state are not the same. A nation predates the state, and it can exist even after the state is destroyed. So some nations have their state has been destroyed, and after a period, long or short, they have recreated the state. And most nations, even to this day, have some people of their own nation living abroad. So there are, let's say, 10 million Hungarians in Hungary. I would say there are another few millions Hungarians outside of Hungary. They are citizens of other states. Are they Hungarians or not? According to the social contract, no. there are Poles and Czechs and Romanians. But according to the idea of the nation, they might be citizens in other states, but they are still part of our of this Hungarian nation or Italian nation or Jewish nation. So basically, this is my view, and as I said, conservatives, or at least many conservatives, share this view about what a nation is.
Okay. Yes, you've mentioned that the foundation of liberal political thinking is the social contract theory. To what extent did Selden and I suppose Edmund Burke after him oppose it?
So basically, both of them were, I mean, their whole way of thinking was opposed to the social contract, both explicitly and implicitly. So in Burke, you can see again and again, he explicitly attacks the idea of the social contract in Rousseau's version, but also other versions. So both in his explicit attacks on the social contract and implicitly in many places where his view of history or society is clearly opposed to the social contract, that is evident. For Selden, this is also true, but we have to understand that when Selden lived, in fact, the social contract was a relatively new idea. So what happened was that in the 16th century, you had a lot of religious wars in Europe. And several thinkers like Hugo Grotius and Thomas Hobbes and others came up with the idea of trying to overcome these civil wars by the idea of the social contract, by saying, actually, let's cut the ties of history and religion that citizens have and create a new kind of allegiance to the state that will replace the old allegiance and create a new kind of state, effectively the modern state as they saw it, that will avoid further conflicts. So with Hobbes, this was explicit. He said the state is the Leviathan, that his role is to be in a way a way of imposing one set of ideas on everyone. Now, what you believe in your heart, you can believe what you want, but outwardly, you have to conform to what the state says, to what the social contract says, because this is the only way to create a working society. Otherwise, for Hobbes, the result would be some level of civil war or civil strife, and eventually a complete war of all against all, which is the state of nature. In his view, the state of nature is a battle of every individual against every other, or at least, or let's say, groups of individuals against other groups. Grotius and the liberal tradition of Locke and Kant, and later on, have a more benevolent view of human nature. They believe that humans in their natural state, if you want, are benevolent, but still, one, they have to find some way to cooperate with each other. And two, in many cases, they don't have the capabilities to really understand or cope with situations where they have to decide in their own interest. There are situations where their own interest and the truth, if you want, collide. So they created the idea of the social contract as a benevolent kind of system where humans, individuals, are essentially rational beings, and the contract is a kind of rational decision by these rational beings, and they create the state and society in this way, according to their rational way of thinking, they discern the natural rights out of thin air, basically. So liberals believe that if a bunch of people in China and in the US each got together in their own country and sat down for a period, they would come up with the same basic natural rights ideas, because it's all of them are rational machines, and they will get to the same conclusions anyway. This is the liberal view. This is why all constitutions are basically have to be liberal constitutions, one way or another. And this is why nations are not a real thing in the political and moral sense. Nations are real, like you might like pizza and I like a hamburger, but essentially, politically, morally, there is no place for the nation in this social contract kind of view. So when Selden was active in intellectual circles and in politics, because he was also an MP and very active in politics and in legal matters, these ideas, like Grotius and other people's, came up, and he was opposed to them. And he opposed them coming out of two essential principles. One is that in the social contract, the liberal social contract, everyone binds himself. Meaning, the reason I am bound to the social contract is because I consent to it. The problem of consent is still a main problem with the social contract theory to this day, because it means that you can always say, okay, I don't like this, I'm out of the social contract. So in theory, you and your friends living in some house can say, we want to succeed from the general social contract, and we create our own nation now, our own state, by a new social contract with us. That's always possible. If we don't like some policy, let's say that our state has created a policy where there is 50% income tax. We don't like it. In theory, the social contract means that we as people that don't want to pay that tax can succeed and create our own state where tax is only 25%, and so on and so forth. You get it. So basically, Selden said, whatever you can tie, you can also untie. Meaning, if the state and society and the contract are only based on your consent, then you can untie it, everyone, and there is no obligation really ever to do anything. You have to convince everyone all the time to agree, which is really a way of inviting either immobility or strife. So his criticism towards this idea of individual consent was that it leads, it's kind of self-destructive. By the way, Hobbes agreed on this part of Selden's criticism, and that is why he said that we need a Leviathan, a sovereign that can actually make everyone obey what he says. Hobbes' social contract was not one where you can actually leave if you want. You have to obey in everything the ruler, because he is keeping you alive, and this is your only right to be alive. Of course, then in Hobbes' system, the problem comes when there's a war between two states, and you come and the other country has more soldiers. Why should you fight for your Leviathan? There is really no reason. You thinking of your own survival, the best way for you would be to go over to the other army, because there is no difference. Both are simply sovereign, and their only goal for you as an individual is to protect your life. So the best way to protect your life is to surrender to your enemy and become part of his army. So it's a kind of self-defeating argument. But what I'm saying is that both Hobbes and Selden identified the idea with individual consent, that it is still dogging liberal thinking to this day. So this is one element. The other element that Selden argued is that people, human beings, are never individuals in the sense that are self-created, meaning every one of us is in fact a result of a specific society, family, culture. So even the way we think is in a very to a very large extent conditioned by our language. So I would say that someone thinking in English and having read English and being educated in English means that his thinking is going in a direction that is somewhat different from a Frenchman, and Hungarian, a Chinese, or a Brazilian, whatever. I think that the term national character, of course, explained that. And Selden argued that this is the reason why every nation needs its own constitution. He gave the example of a goat. He said, a goat is a goat everywhere, true or false? In theory, it's true, but in practice, it's false, because if you take a goat from Morocco and a goat from Scotland and you switch them, they would probably die very soon, because for one, it's too warm, and one, it's too cold. So on one level, both are goats, but they are also a result of their environment. In the same way, he argued, constitutions are the result of a society and a culture, in a sense that the British Constitution is perfect for the British. But if you would try to bring it to France, it would crumble, because it's based on so many unwritten principles that exist. The same, of course, with the American Constitution. So I can give you an example. Selden didn't give this example because he wasn't alive when America was founded, but there are large parts of the American Constitution that are unwritten. One example is, where in the American Constitution is the cabinet? I mean, America is governed by a cabinet, but it does not exist in the Constitution at all. What is in the Constitution is that the president today can actually appoint ministers for various functions. That's it. There is no cabinet at all in the Constitution. So theoretically, a president today could say, listen, I don't want to appoint any Secretary of State, say anything. I am going to rule myself. Is it possible by the Constitution? Yes. In fact, is it possible to rule that way? Of course, that is not true. All Americans would say, what do you mean rule by myself? That would create chaos in government. So, but again, this is something that does not exist in the written Constitution. And so Selden and others in the conservative tradition believe that, for instance, some countries are by their nature, by the culture, more attuned to a centralist government. Let's say populations that are more rebellious and are more homogeneous, maybe, respond better to a centralist government, while other traditions like the American and the British one, where there's a lot of self-government, and in fact the central government relies on local government for much of the activity, then a different kind of constitution is fitted. So this all points to the fact that Selden said, thinking of individuals as some kind of unconnected bubble that can, bubbles can sometimes stick to each other. So a view of the social contract is like bubbles connecting with themselves, attaching and creating a kind of mega bubble. But in fact, Selden thought that human beings are not bubbles. Each of us is a result of our own upbringing, particular religion, culture, language, and so on. And this is the main reason why we function in society, not because of some abstract social contract. So in fact, the reason why society functions, and it functions good for us, and it can continue to function, is because we are part of these traditions that are mainly recognized as the nation. Of course, not only, but the nation is the main focus of these traditions. And of course, the fact that we rely on traditions doesn't mean that they cannot change. In fact, Selden explained that traditions change all the time. He said, in my days, he was speaking English. He acknowledged that the English he was speaking was not the English that was spoken in England 1,000 years earlier. Certainly, the structure of the language might be the same, and some words might be the same, but many words were not the same. Many words were loaned for various. So clearly, Selden wouldn't know what an avocado or a banana is. But on the other hand, many of the concepts and terms used are still used by us in the same sense. So this combination of conservation and change is the idea behind the view of Selden and Burke about the way societies work effectively, a way that is totally opposed to the social contract view.
Yes. Okay. So tell me about how Selden incorporated Jewish law and Jewish philosophy into his thinking.
So basically, Selden was a very curious person. So he was very interested in many cultures. So his initial approach to Hebrew texts and the Jewish tradition was out of his basically his thirst for knowledge. So this guy apparently knew knew thoroughly more than 20 languages. He taught himself languages, including, let's say, Talmudic Aramaic, including Arabic. All these languages, he basically taught himself these languages and was quite proficient in them. He was in many of these languages, he was regarded as the highest authority in England of his day. So he had this great thirst for knowledge. But when he came across the Hebrew traditions, and when he went to read them in the original, because usually at that time, people were receiving Hebrew knowledge or Jewish knowledge through many lenses of people that were not in the original, and they were usually transmitted by people who were sometimes, I would say, sometimes had negative views, sometimes not necessarily negative views, but were very, I would say, using Hebrew ideas for a very specific use, let's say. For one example is Henry VIII of England. King Henry VIII, he was king 2 generations before Selden, and he tried to use Jewish sources to justify his divorcing his wives. So that is an example. He was looking at a very specific angle for that. So Selden really encountered the great treasure of Jewish thought and started to familiarize himself with it. But very soon, he came to a conclusion that the Jewish tradition has 2 very beneficial effects for European and more specifically English legal and political thought. And that these 2 effects are, one, he found within the Jewish tradition a kind of theory of natural law that is different from the abstract theory of the social contract, meaning a theory that is contingent, that is universal, but also contingent on the particular circumstances and on history. If you want, I can go into it later. So this is one thing that he was very interested in. The other thing is that Jewish history and Jewish traditions afforded him a good parallel for the common law. Why did he need this? Because, as I said, at that period, the ideas that created liberalism and the social contract were the same ideas that were saying we need a strong authority to prevent wars and civil wars. So some went in the direction of having some kind of social contract and abstract laws that came out of thin air, out of your head. Other people said, no, we need a strong authority, a strong king. So they developed the idea of the divine right of kings, that basically the king is the absolute ruler of all society. This was not a medieval idea. It's a relatively modern idea. It was developed by people like Filmer, to some extent, you could say Baudin, to some extent Hobbes. All of these said a ruling authority is necessary for society to work, and it's divinely inspired. And so rights and laws and traditions are a gift of the monarch. He can give it or he can take it. Basically, King James I of Scotland and England wrote a book called Doron Basilicon, The Gift of the King. And he said, all the laws, the common law is a gift from the king, and a gift can be given and can be taken away. So these two ideas, the social contract and divine right of kings, were basically both agreeing on one point, that the common law and the traditions are irrelevant. The liberals were saying what is important is individual consent. The absolutists were saying what is important is the will of the king. And so this middle way, this conservative tradition, was trying to defend the authority of tradition, in a sense. So you had to find a universal kind of justification for your own tradition, for your own law. How can you defend, justify the common law, the English law, if you want, later on the American law, the French law, so on, before someone saying, no, we only need one universal law for everyone. So Selden said, first of all, the structure of Jewish law, the Bible, the Talmud, and the later commentaries, is structured the same as the common law. The common law really is level upon level upon level. So you don't go actually and say, in the 5th century, this Saxon king said so and so, but it develops with society. So it's a kind of way of knowing, of learning, and of working that is developing itself. So the law is, in a sense, a living thing, like society. In society, we have always young people, middle-aged people, old people, and they live together in society. Some die, some are born, and it's ever-changing. But still, we think that it's the same society. We still think of the same English society across centuries. Although, of course, no one lived all these centuries, but everyone lives 50, 70, 100 years. But still, we believe it's the same corporate body, if you want. So in this way, Selden and later thinkers of tradition introduced this if you want, way of saying that tradition learns all the time and adapts itself all the time to the new times. So it retains the wisdom of the past, and is also being renewed. So in a way, Selden said, in this way, every person who is heir to a long tradition, it is as if he lived 1,000 years, while everyone who only relies on his reason or is on the king's will is someone who was born yesterday, because he has nothing to learn from, right? So basically, it is the same idea that later informs the famous saying by Newton, right? I've seen farther than anyone else because I'm standing on the shoulder of giants. In this meaning, Newton said scientific development is not some genius coming out of the blue saying I understand everything, but actually building on the successes and the failures of his predecessors. In the same way, Selden said, a working society, a working legal system builds on these generations. And in this way, he saw the Jewish tradition as the most long-lived one. And for that reason, the most successful, in the sense that it preserves a national tradition through thousands of years to his day, and in fact to this day.
So I'd like to end on this note. In Selden's thinking, how is the English common law tradition essential to the English national character?
So basically, what is interesting is that the English common law was never written by anyone. So you cannot say this guy created the common law. In a way, you could say that the American Constitution was created at Philadelphia. But as I said, even the founders believed that they were building on older traditions. That is certainly the case on the common law. You cannot say it started here. Even if you go to Magna Carta, to 1215, you will find that Magna Carta says this charter is a restoration of all the rights. You go to the oldest English charters, you find they're always saying we are based on the past. So it's an ever receding past. So basically, it is like a family, a society, a tradition. Basically, it has the capability to adapt, but in a sense, it is always created by the society which it reflects. So unlike a law that is created by a king who says, these are the laws, the common law is a reflection of the society, because when society changes, the law changes accordingly. And on the other hand, it is shaped by the society itself, is shaped by the law. So you have a kind of circle, a virtuous circle where society informs the law, and the law in many ways shapes the way this society works and thinks. So the sanctity of property in common law means that people who live in a common law system believe that property is a very important part of society functioning, and then they inform the law accordingly. And so it's in a way an ever reinforcing circle in this way. And that is why basically the English common law has survived for so long, while other so-called perfect systems that were created in other countries, that France today has its, I think, its 20th constitution since the French Revolution. So they change their constitution about 20 times. And when I mean change the constitution, it's not a little change. They become a monarchy, an empire, a republic, presidential republic, and parliamentary republic, and the law changed greatly in the same way. So they, in a way, reinvent themselves, and on the way, they lose a lot of themselves. That is at least the belief of the traditionalists, starting with Selden.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, Ofir Haivry, for joining the show.
Thank you very much.